This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London.
Well, welcome everybody. Thank you very much for coming. It's great to see an audience, but no surprise to see an audience drawn here by Eric Csapo, this year's Webster Fellow. Webster is in some way the godfather of the Institute of Classical Studies. He came to UCL as Professor of Greek in 1948 after already being a very successful professor in Manchester since the early 30s, and set about organising a coalition of the University of London and the Hellenic and Roman societies, which he hoped would match the Warburg Institute, Institute of Historical Research, other great names from the past, the Courtauld, and set up an Institute of Classical Studies, which he did, then appointing Eric Turner to run it. Since 1999, we've appointed, in Webster's memory, Webster Fellows, who've come to work for 6 weeks, a bit longer, in the Institute, ideally, as Eric has, to travel around the country spreading the good news of what he and we do, and also to give one lecture, the Webster Lecture. Now, Webster's work, if you look it up in the library catalogues, he's super referable, really. He has half his publications are a series of path-making books on Greek literature, but particularly prose as well as poetry, particularly Greek drama, and the other half works on Greek vases, Greek art and so on. And the idea that you could ever successfully attract somebody to a position in classics by saying, must be world expert on Greek literature, speciality in prose and literature, 5th and 4th centuries ideal, and also it'd be good if you could publish a whole bunch of vases in our museum and lay down the foundations for that discipline as well. And you would never ever get anyone to do that, but that's what he did. Since 1999, the Webster Fellows have ideally been appointed for their expertise in either Greek literature or in Greek archaeology, Greek art and archaeology. We've had some wonderful Webster Fellows in the past, but it's actually a super coup to get someone who's an expert in both. And so we're welcoming Eric here, who's able, as he is in his talk today on To Release What They Tell Us About Greek Comedy, to show that the classics is a thoroughly unified field, that we were interdisciplinary before it was ever thought of. And so it's great to have that celebration here. Eric himself, a latter-day Webster, another huge series of magnificent works, published to begin with in his native Canada, where for many years he worked in Toronto when he wasn't dashing off around the world to take up prestigious international fellowships, like the one he holds at the moment, I should say. And then in 2005, he was summoned to the other end of the world, to Sydney, and since then has been the powerhouse of the University of Sydney Classics. So it's wonderful we managed to attract Eric here for a short time, for a long time in fact, and so we're very, very glad to have you. It's been great having you here. We're looking forward very much to hearing your lecture on To Release and what they can tell us about Greek comedy. Eric, welcome.
Thanks very much, Greg, and thank you to the ICS for a wonderful opportunity to be at a great library in what I think is the world's most interesting city. And thanks to all the colleagues here in London who've shown me tremendous hospitality since I arrived. This is a very Websterian kind of talk, dealing with material that Webster himself first published. So I'll launch right into it. Is that okay? I hear a little bit of buzzing or feedback or something. Is it okay? I've got the microphone's all right? Okay, you tell me if I need to adjust it somehow or move it away from my mouth. So, at the Athenian Dionysia, from about 508 BC, tripods were given as prizes for men's and boys' circular choruses, popularly called dithyrambs. The prize notionally went to the tribe that sponsored the chorus, but it was given to the kouregos, who was obliged to mount it on a monument in a public public space to commemorate the victory. Dramatic choregoi memorialize their victories in a less magnificent manner. They made dedications that were placed in the sanctuary of Dionysus. Our written sources indicate two kinds of memorial that were made by dramatic choregoi who were victorious at the Dionysia. Pinaques and masks. A pinax can mean a painted wooden plaque, a painted or fired terracotta image, or a relief sculpture of stone or even bronze. I give here the sum total of written sources for pinax dedications. Mask dedications are also evidenced by Aeschylus's Isthmiastai and a fragment of Aristophanes. The dedication of masks is confirmed by the use of hanging masks as an iconographic index of the temple of Dionysus. The same is true of pinaques, except that unlike masks, pinaques could be dedicated to any god, not only to Dionysus. Pinaques indicate any kind of sanctuary setting. In art, we see two kinds of pinaques, those that are attached to a wall in a temple or sanctuary, and those that are mounted on columns. Those mounted on columns can also be of two types. If the pinax is a painting, then it is protected by an often temple-shaped box with doors that you can open to look at the painting and then close to protect the painting from the weather. Pinaques that are stone reliefs do not need such protection, and so are mounted directly on a column. On the famous so-called Icarius reliefs, Dionysus brings a ribbon to tie on the head of a victorious poet or actor. Note the masks underneath the couch of the victor. The setting is Dionysus' sanctuary, as marked, among other things, by dedicatory victory pinaques. Quite a number of dedicatory pinaques survive. Among them, several that are identifiable as dedications of victorious choregoi at the Dionysia in Athens and in Attica. The total number of choregic pinax fragments is slim, but they do permit a typology, which is frequently confirmed by echoes in contemporary Attic vase painting, by dedications from the revival of the choregia in Hadrianic times, or by artifacts from theatrical traditions influenced by Athens. The most common type of dramatic choregic pinax to survive is a mask relief, an image that alludes to the other more expensive and less permanent type of dedication, namely a dedication of actual masks used in the production. Fragments of some 24 pinaques of this type were found in the 19th century excavations in the area of the theater and sanctuary of Dionysus in Athens, although only 2 of them were subsequently published. These are the reliefs on the upper left and center. On the right is the fragment of a pinax from the deme of Icarion. It's probably the best known of this group. The masks are in rough shape, so we can't even tell the name of the genre for certain. Green thinks that they are masks from satyr play. What is certain is that this is a choregic monument. You can read the inscription. An O for the final U of a patronymic, and echorege was choregos. Icarion evidently shared this dedicatory practice with Athens. The terracotta plaque with masks on the lower left is probably too small to be an actual dedication. It may be a miniature replica, probably originally intended as decoration for domestic rooms. The most common subject of dramatic pinaques is a series of worshippers who approach a recumbent drinking Dionysus, normally with a female figure sitting at the end of his dining couch and sometimes with an attendant fetching wine. That these are choregic is clear from the inscription, upper left, Lucias choragon, though it's unknown why the participle is in Doric dialect. That the worshippers approach a recumbent Dionysus is clear from the inscriptions on the two pinnaces on the right. The inscribed dedication on the upper right pinax is to Dionysus. Note that only half of the pinax is there. To the right of the woman with the mask, we can see the knees of Dionysus reclining on his cline. Dedicatory inscriptions are normally centered on the upper frame, and so there is room here for a los choregos and possibly further nomenclature. An inscription on the Piraeus relief, lower right, identifies the recumbent figure as Dionysus. Note too, my new reading of the inscription under the young lady. Here, in the past, she was thought to be Paideia, a supposed personification of satyr play, not entirely appropriate to a scene which shows three tragic Choreutes dressed as backhands. It appears that she is Sophia, a personification, perhaps not of wisdom, but of the dramatic craft, which is called Sophia in Aristophanes, as poetry is generally by classical authors. I've checked this against a plaster cast that's now in Berlin, that was taken soon after the monument was pulled out of Piraeus Harbor in 1881, and I've also had that checked against a plaster cast now in Vienna. That all these pinaces deal specifically with drama is clear from the masks that appear in three of them, and of course the Choreutes dressed as backhands in the Piraeus relief. The lower two pinaces were found in Attica and outside Athens, and probably record dramatic victories at the Dionysia of Eleusis and Piraeus. Note too that remnants of the tenon that fixed the pinax to a column are visible on the two reliefs on the left. Related to this subject is a pinax found built into a church near the theater of the Attic deme of Spetos. This pinax shows 15 men approaching a Dionysus who holds a cantharos on the other side of the altar. The men are evidently the members of a victorious tragic chorus, as the central figure on the foreground holds the crown of victory in his hand. All of these pinaces have what we might call religious subject matter. They seem to have been placed in a sanctuary. They sometimes use the language of dedication. They have subject matter that shows dedications, worshippers bringing sacrifice, and worshippers approaching the god himself in the sanctuary. This is what we might expect, but it is important. The memorials for dramatic victories act like normal dedications. They behave in a manner quite unlike the tripod monuments, the memorials for victories for tribal circular choruses at the city Dionysia. No base for or part of the tripod monument was found in the sanctuary of Dionysus. The only remnants we have are the monuments of Nicias and Thrasylos, both of 319, which border the theater. All other bases are on the adjacent to the street of the tripods that stretch from the theater to the Panathenaic Way in the Agora. It's true that Plato and Essaias refer to some 5th century monuments as tripods in the Dionysian, but this is likely to be shorthand for the open space between the Odeon and the actual temenos, where quite a number of bases for 5th century tripods have been found. And this is the beginning of the Street of the Tripods, which runs up this way. The inscriptions of tripod monuments typically declare victory. They name the personnel, the tribe, and the date. As Peter Wilson says, the urban choregic inscription presents itself as a recorder of victorious personnel rather than a dedication. It presents itself as a memorial of the chorus rather than a gift to Dionysus. The reliefs on tripod monuments, though they may show Dionysus, typically focus upon the symbols of victory, either the prizes, the tripods and bulls, or Nikai, the personifications of victory. When real people appear on the reliefs of tripod monuments, it's usually the choral personnel, the choragus or the choreutes. Occasionally one sees satyrs, the mythical correlatives of the choreutes. Rarely does Dionysus appear. This is even clearer on the vase paintings that adapt the imagery of tripod monuments into the dithyrambic victory. It's victory, its prizes and its glory, not Dionysus, that are celebrated here. The elation is thematized, not piety. These differences between dramatic pinakes and tripod monuments may prove helpful, but they're not absolute. In general, 50% of choregic memorials of all types from the demes have a dedicatory formula using anetheke, as opposed to virtually none of the tripod dedications from the city of Athens. This may reflect deme conservatism, but also probably the fact that in the demes, memorials of victory, even tripod monuments, were located in the sanctuaries. For dramatic dedications in the city, our evidence is admittedly limited. Apart from the reliefs we'll look at in a moment, of all the remains of 7 pinakes that can be identified as dramatic choregic dedications, 4 come from deme sites, 2 more may be demotic, since they have no reported find spots, and only 1 object is certainly from Athens. But 2 of the 3 that might be from Athens still have their accompanying inscription. One of these explicitly uses the language of dedication. Heraies dedicated this to Dionysus. The other leaves the dedicatory verb to be implied, as often in dedications. Lysias, the son of Apollodorus, while choregos with dedicated this, understood. It's very different from the language of tripod memorials for the tribal dithyrambic competitions. Here, we have just credits and boasting, no language of dedication. The Lysicrates monument inscription is typical. Lysicrates, son of Lysithiades of Kikina, was choregos. Achamantis was victorious in the boys' chorus. Theon played pipes. Lysiades of Athens was the didaskalos. Euaenetus was archon. As mentioned earlier, it's not just the language of the tripod monuments that is non-religious, so is their imagery. In addition to more purely victory imagery, another surviving subject for a monument for dithyramb is the performers themselves, the chorus. But this is a very rare subject. Indeed, unique to the Atarbus monument, the combined monument for victory in circular chorus and pyrrhicae, but almost certainly both at the Panathenea, not the Dionysia. At the Panathenea, no tripod prize was awarded. So it does not really come into the discussion here. Nor does the, in some ways, comparable 3854, which again shows Pyrrhic choreutes from the Panathenea. There is indirect evidence of choregic dedications showing dramatic choruses and performance. The language of Aristotle, when talking about the fad for gentlemen playing the pipes in post-Persian War Athens, implies that you could actually see the choragus Thrasybus playing the pipes on the pinax that he dedicated when he was a choragos for Ecphantides. Very rarely, we also get images of tragic choruses and performance that might seem to be inspired by choregic pinax art. But of surviving pinaces, only the Piraeus pinax for tragedy details the chorus members enough to give the vaguest hint of actual performance, even though we are clearly notionally in the sanctuary setting with Dionysus. We see 3 Coryutes on the left in the costume of backhands and approaching Dionysus. The leftmost Coryute originally wore a mask. There's still fringes of hair detectable on the shoulder, though the mask was chiseled out, probably by some Christian fanatic who saw in it a sign of demonic possession. It is, in fact, something close to that. The Coryute who wears the mask falls into his role. He raises his tympanum and seems to shake it. Here the movement is minimal, but it is a motif familiar from vase paintings that are related to choregic art and appears to have been a stock motif from at least the mid-5th century. A half-dozen vase paintings include a contrast between Coryutes who have removed their masks and regained their civic persona, and a Coryute who retains or has donned the mask and becomes the dramatic character. But the paintings presuppose a space in the sanctuary before or after the performance, and at a guess, they take their initial inspiration from the kind of dedicatory scenes we have in the choregic pinaces, with the Coryutes juxtaposed to the god. 2 comic reliefs from the Athenian Agora are therefore very special. They are the only reliefs from antiquity to show dramatic choruses in performance. Both have long been known. They were published by Webster in 1960, but perhaps because of their fragmentary state, they've not been studied nearly as much as they deserve. S2098 was found during excavations at the Eleusinian in the Athenian Agora on July 8, 1959, built into a late wall. Note that this is very far from the sanctuary of Dionysus, and we'll consider the importance of the location a little later. The published photograph makes the block look squarish and chunky, but the squareness is an optical illusion created by the fact that the wall builders cut an oblique slice out of the left side. 2 original edges are preserved, and they show that the dimensions are those of an average largish pinax dedication, with the thickness ranging from 8 centimeters at the edge and extending to 17 centimeters at the bottom lip. It was roughly half a meter high and 80 centimeters to a meter in width. This scene, restored by Yannis Nakas under my direction, preserves a comic chorus dancing in rectangular formation. The chorus wears uniform masks with only slight and perhaps unintentional variations, and uniform costumes. It marches to a uniform step. There are clear indications of body tights and the comic sommation with buttock and belly padding, features of comic costume that Coryutes evidently shared with actors. The high step presents any determination on the hotly contested question whether Coryutes also wore the phallus, and if so, was it the same or different to those worn by actors. The Coryutes wear what appears to be a pillbox-style hat. It is not an actual polos, as Webster suggested. They wear a short chiton, a short cloak, and possibly mask M, according to Green, and not N, as in Monuments Illustrating. It's the mask of a mature male. The piper at the front is added to the reconstruction somewhat arbitrarily on the analogy of other scenes of this sort that we'll look at a bit later. The line is shown as 2 ranks deep. Although votives occasionally do show formations of groups of people with more than 2 ranks, the results are confusing and seem to be avoided when showing choral groups. 2 deep gives a better sense of order than 3 or 4 deep. 2 deep is the universally preferred depth, if any depth is shown at all, as we can see from the parallels on the right, 2 of which are pinaces and 1 almost certainly a choregic votive, though from the Deme Dionysia. Because we think we know that comic choruses were 24, this means that the 6 by 2 formation stands for a formation of 6 by 4. The pinax does not show the side with 4, however, because there are remains of a 5th first-rank chorute at the upper left. We'll return to S2098, but it's time now to look at the other fragmentary relief. There are 4 fragments. The monument is probably known to you, if at all, through the standard museum photograph which was published by Webster. The monument looks flat, and you might expect that I'll argue that it's a pinax, but the photograph is deceiving and the truth is more interesting. There are indeed 4 fragments, but one of them, fragment B, has a return. Here, B2 in the lower right, with the legs of the chorute in the same pose as on the other fragments. This return is unreported in any discussion of the monument before Sophie Agilidis' dissertation published in 2008. B2 makes a big difference. It shows that the original sculpture was a rectangular object with chorutes marching around at least 2 and probably all 4 sides. Before we look at the images more closely, let's notice the stylistic dating, about 350 or 340 BC, the same as our pinax that we just reconstructed, though the pinax was, of course, a stylistic comparandum, so there is a component of circularity in the mix, but not much, since the dating by J.R. Green is based mainly on the vast corpus of theater iconography, giving mask and costume details. Whatever the absolute dating, the sculpture and our pinax have broad similarities. The pillbox hats, the masks, probably M again, the body padding, but especially the choral formation and its stance. All this suggests fairly close contemporaneity. Another common feature is the find spot. Both of our sculptures must originally have been located near the Eleusinion, just beyond the southeast corner of the Agora. Here, you can see the locations where the fragments of the second relief were found. A was taken out of a modern wall, just above the Eleusinion. B and D were found in marble dumps, so presumably had wandered a bit, but not too far. C was found during excavation. All center upon the area of the Eleusinion. I'll tell you later why I think this is important. The layout of the published photograph, here upper left, is, as we said, misleading. Not only does it disguise the return on B, but it suggests that D belongs to the same side of the relief as do B, A, B, and C. I asked Yanis, an expert object draftsman, to try and put all the fragments on one side, but it didn't work. Fragment D is on a different scale from the other pieces. You can see this most easily if you look at the drawing, at the disconnect between the stick carried by the chorute, who's second from the right. The top of the stick on C does not line up with the bottom preserved on D. What we have is evidence of at least 2 sides, one drawn on a slightly smaller scale, presumably because the object was rectangular rather than square. Notice that the figures get smaller as one moves from left to right. This is an attempt to create perspective, as if the figure on the left were closer to us than the figure on the right. We'll look at this again in a moment. But the important thing to notice here is that on the short side, the figures diminish at a greater rate. Possibly, we also had no piper on the short side. So, what is the object that we're looking at? It has iconography very like the choregic pinax that we earlier reconstructed, but cannot itself be a pinax. The fragments must surely belong to the base of a choregic relief pinax. The original base formed a rectangle of about 75 centimeters wide across the front and back and 57 to 65 centimeters on the sides. The question you're all asking yourselves, I expect, is do our pinax and our pinax monument base go together? I incline, so I see no reason to exclude this possibility, and they do have a lot in common, but I incline rather to think that the common elements have more to do with the stock characteristics of the choregic pinax sculpting industry of about 350 BC than with the stylistic consistencies of a single monument. For this reason, the actual pinax in our reconstruction is a cheeky comic parody of the Piraeus pinax. One reason for thinking the iconography generic is offered by the only other surviving image of a comic chorus in performance, a fragmentary kous in the Benaki Museum that's been dated around 360, just a touch earlier than our sculptures. It shows two groups of Koryuts converging in a line towards a central piper. The novelty of this variation may have less to do with actual choral practice than the vase painter's concern for balance and symmetry on the curved front of a pot. Pinyatoglu did use our sculptures as models for the high-stepping march movement in a reconstructed drawing, but this seems justified by the degree to which the Koryuts lean back, as seen in the preserved upper body of the Koryut right of the piper. The kous is, in at least one way, even closer to our reliefs than the reconstruction shows. The fragment preserving the upper body of the Koryut indicates that the hands of the Koryuts were placed on their hips, as in our sculpted pinax, and not tucked into their belts. The fragment offers no evidence of a belt. There is in any case much that can be compared with our sculptures. On top of the usual belly-padded somation, we see a short chiton, short cloak, and headgear. The headgear on the kous consists of a wide band across the forehead. Like the Koryuts on our monument base, the chorus carries sticks over its left shoulders, but in this case it carries boughs, said by Pinyatoglu to be with fruit but without foliage. Quite unlike the reliefs, we have here details of a background setting, a sanctuary, indicated by the string of bull skulls with strings of knotted wool on their horns and the remnants of palm trees bordering either side of the image. As in our monument base, there's a piper who leads the chorus, but surprisingly, the hands are in added white, which might suggest that the piper is thought of as being female. There's no reason to think the piper on the monument base is anything other than male, although earlier commentators were sometimes tempted to think him female because of the length of the garment. But this is a standard piper's costume length in classical Athens. Something our monument base has that is quite distinctive is the trace of an inscription on the panel of the relief itself. The principal inscriptions for choregic pinaques, or reliefs on bases for choregic monuments, are on the upper band above the image, and in much more formal lettering style than we find on our relief. The letters on our comic relief are not well cut, not squared, and not written in a line. They most resemble the usually informal name labeling one finds on the lower frame of sculpted votives. or the name labels found in vase painting, whether influenced by Koregic art or not. Webster first transcribed chon with a he in monuments illustrating Old and Middle Comedy. This was changed to kon with a kappa, in conformity with the Agora catalog card, probably because the editors wanted to read something like choros komi kon, comic chorus, though this is certainly too bland, and it is not, strictly speaking, correct Greek. Editors have looked also for a gamma to give choregon, while choregos, but the first visible trace of a letter is definitely not gamma. You can see from the remains, I hope, that Webster's first reading of he is almost certainly correct. The high, march-like step may have influenced Bieber's and Webster's assumption that the chorus is composed of soldiers. The pillbox hats are not, however, kausii, which are the typical Macedonian soldiers' caps. And even Webster was uncomfortable with the idea of soldiers carrying sticks instead of spears. Could they possibly be a chorus of stick-wielders, rabdukoi, who kept order at the contest, like the chorus of the much earlier comedy of that name by the poet Plato? Chorus rabduchon, chorus of stick-wielders, would be at least a more descriptive label, and I'll add it to my reconstruction, exempli gratia. Notice that if we continue the line of letters, we find that they are not aligned to the frame of the relief, but oriented to the perspective line running over the Koryuts' heads. This seems to me a confirmation that the label is meant to characterize the Koryuts and not the monument as a whole. The attempt at perspective can tell us something about the imagined choral formation. As with the pinnax, the monument base on what I will call the front panel has the remains of at least 5 Koryuts in a line. In our late sources, if our late sources are right, that comedy had 24 Koryuts, then a square formation would be 6 times 4, and we must be looking at the side with 6. I remind you that we have the remains of 6 Koryuts on the comparable image of the Benaki Kus. On our relief, the bodies overlap from left to right, and they get smaller as we move from left to right. On B2, for example, which must represent the extreme left of the line, the distance from ground line to the toe of the Koryut's raised foot is 8 centimeters. For the second Koryut on A, probably the 4th in the sequence, the same distance is 6.5 centimeters, while on B1, the last and 6th Koryut in the sequence, the measurement is 6 centimeters from ground to toe. I assume that Korygic monuments attempted a degree of what we might call theater realism in their depiction of choruses. I also assume that the gaze of the Koryuts is putting us in the position of the theater audience. Given these assumptions, we are clearly meant to think of these Koryuts as the first rank, numbers 1 to 6, seen from an oblique angle. This is what Pollux calls the formation by ranks. The sculptor has lowered the ground line under the feet of the piper as if he were on a different plane. This seems an attempt to show that the piper is not in the choral line, but leading it from in front and center, as we would expect. A truer perspective would have placed the piper in front of the middle Koryuts, awkwardly obscuring the chorus's imposing approach, and would have given the piper importance at the chorus's expense. Gregory Sifakis, in 1971, argued that we're looking at an important moment in the performance, the parados, or the moment when the chorus entered the theater. This, he argued fairly, is the key moment, and he adduced evidence to show how important it was felt to create a powerful first impression. Our angular perspective would seem to confirm his observations. We cannot totally exclude the possibility that we're dealing with the exodus of the chorus from the theater. But there are three considerations that greatly favor Sifakis' interpretation of our reliefs as parados impressions. First, in Aristophanes' plays, we often have marching entrances, but generally disorderly exits in the form of a victory or marriage commence. Secondly, the perspective we are given of the choral formation here suits the God's eye view. That is to say, from the middle of the front row of seats, where Dionysus himself, in the form of his icon, sat in the theater. Most important, according to our sources, is that the best dancers be the most visible. This is the advantage of the entrance by ranks. Choral terminology, from the time of Plotinus onwards, called the best dancers left standers. The second best dancers, the right standers, closed the formation at the back, while the worst dancers stood in between. These were called alley standers. A parados in the formation by ranks allowed the best dancers to be the most visible to most of the audience. The Pinax offers a comparable but different perspective. Here the figures overlap from right to left, not left to right, it's on the base. We're probably still looking at the front rank of elite left standers, but they're not in the formation by ranks, where the piper leads 6 columns, but in the formation by files, where the piper leads 4 columns. We're privileging the same line of dancers, but they've been displaced 90 degrees counterclockwise. Let's turn now to some bigger questions. Why are the only images of comic choral performance that survive from antiquity all artifacts made in the mid-4th century? And why were the 2 choregic reliefs that have such imagery not found in the sanctuary of Dionysus, but on the other side of the Acropolis in the area of the Eleusinion? I believe that the answers to these questions about time and place are related. When I began my discussion, I made some basic distinctions between dedications for drama and the memorials for victory in Dithyramb at the Dionysia. Apart from our agora monuments, all choregic dramatic pinaches were, so far as we can tell, dedications made in the sanctuary of Dionysus. They generally use an iconographic scheme that places the chorus as worshipper or bringer of offerings in some relationship to the god. Choregic tripod monuments for dithyrambic victories, on the other hand, show, in Peter Wilson's words, an avoidance of the actual sanctuary of Dionysus, and also use language that displays what we might call an avoidance of the dedicatory. No divine recipient is mentioned. Verbs of dedication are used only rarely, and the iconography is not primarily religious. Instead of being placed in the sanctuary, the tripod monuments are around the sanctuary, and most especially along the public street leading to the sanctuary, namely the street of the tripods, from which they even spilled over, as recent finds show, onto adjacent streets. The language of tripod dedications memorializes the tribe, the choregos, and sometimes the poet and piper. And the imagery, though it may have Dionysian content, is more intensely focused on victory symbolism. They present, as Wilson says, a memorial of the chorus rather than a gift to Dionysus. In terms of these distinctions, it's obvious that the reliefs of comic choruses in performance that are the particular object of our investigation show all the wrong traits. We do not have the inscriptions that accompanied these monuments, but we can see that the focus of the iconography is on the performers, and most significantly, that the monuments were found around the Eleusinion, which is at the far end of the Street of the Tripods. The course of the Street of the Tripods is very well marked by the remains of Koretic monuments from the theatre to number 16 of the modern Odos Tripodon, where the ancient road turned onto the modern Prytaniou. From that point, there are foundations of probable but not certain Koretic monuments all the way along Prytaniou to the Eleusinian on the Panathenaic Way. Remains of the ancient road show a fork at the intersection of modern Prytaniou and Tholu, right up there. And these are branches of the road that meet at the Panathenaic Way on either side of the Eleusinian. It is, in short, overwhelmingly likely that the original location of our monuments was on the western end of the Street of the Tripods. So our reliefs are behaving more like tripod monuments than like dramatic pinnaces. How could this be? My guess is that something happened that made celebrating comic performances more like celebrating performances for dithyramb. Dramatic victories were not public affairs in the same way that dithyrambic victories were. For drama, it was entirely the work of an individual to recruit and train a chorus. But for dithyramb, the production was in a real sense by the tribe, of the tribe, and for the tribe. It's the phyletic nature of dithyramb that justified the placing of elaborate monuments to victory in a public space. The Koregic monuments on Tripod Street named the tribe as the victor. The Koregos was licensed to glorify himself publicly as agent and representative of the tribe. The emphasis was clearly on celebrating the cooperative public spirit of Koregos tribal officials and the members of the tribe who contributed annually the labor of 100 of their sons for the glorification of Athens' principal annual festival. Dramatic Koregoi, on the other hand, worked on more of an individual basis, without tribal affiliation, and comparatively few shared in their victory. Their dedications were placed in the sanctuary, a public but not civic space. The memorials were comparatively modest and, for the most part, perishable, whereas the tribes pursued their competition beyond the Dionysia by accumulating trophies that vied in the public space for numbers, size, and artistic magnificence. But the sponsoring of comic choruses that had for a century been individual became tribal sometime before about 325 BC. We know this from Aristotle, whose constitution of the Athenians tells us that the eponymous archon formerly appointed 5 choregoi for comedy, but now the tribes have responsibility for them. We have no evidence for when this took place, but it's a reasonable guess that it was part of the Eubulin Theatre Revitalization Project that saw, among other things, the building of the stone theatre that was finished under Lycurgus. It was also under Eubulus that the monument known as the Fasti, if we accept the traditional dating, was erected. Its main purpose was probably to celebrate and stimulate the public spirit of Athenian tribes and choregoi, and through their public zeal to increase the brilliance of Athens' lucrative theatrical festivals. Indeed, indications are that the new tribal basis of comic competition was so successful that it continued even after the Koregic system was abandoned in or by 307 BC. I conclude, therefore, by suggesting that it was the change to tribal organization that is behind the sudden appearance of about 350 BC of monumental sculpture showing comic choruses in performance. It is doubtless the emergence of a new kind of comic imagery coming into a new and very public space that struck the painter of the Benaki Kus as something worthy of imitation. The reliefs focus upon the massed organized body of the comic chorus, stressing its depth, numbers, and unity. This stress on numbers and unity may also resonate with a new way of producing comedy. The Choreutes were now not just dancers, but representatives of their tribe, the 10th part of the Athenian population. Where once the entire cost and organizational burden had fallen upon a single individual, that burden was now shared by an efficient tribal apparatus for financing and training Choreutes that had been in place already for a century and a half of dithyrambic competition. The speaker of Antiphon 6, for example, names 4 tribal epimules who aided him in training his boys' chorus. The new imagery, like the new organization, emphasized the dynamic entry of a new collective body into the Athenian theater.